and maybe other places as well. So good to have you here with us. I hope it's worth your while. I know you started well because we had a nice meal. So in that regard, Marianti, would you ask those in the kitchen to come on out here? I want to thank those who prepared the food for us because they did a delightful job. This is a blessed community. Anytime we have anything, and I ask that we need some sort of a light mezedes, they really come through for us. There's no such thing as light in their mind. It's always mezedes. They're probably too shy to come on out, but it was so good, we'll wait. Father Makarios and I go way back. We've been friends for 46 years. We just did the calculations. 46 years of friendship. We had similar roots, and then the plants grew kind of parallel, and then they diversion went into different directions. Okay, here we go. I want us all to express our gratitude to she who is running away. The ladies and one gentleman that really helped a lot with this were Barb Short, Kimi Lahagi, John Melandis, carrying the founders of the Alt Aid, and many others who assisted them and helped put everything together. So thank you for your shout out and putting your hands together for them. They always do such a nice job. Okay, thank you, ladies and John. As I was saying, Father Makarios and I had similar roots. He was from Utah, I was from Colorado. He served in the military early. I served in the military later. We start to see the divergence. After college, we both united at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology because he did his military service before college. He is a tad older than I. And he was a few years ahead of me in seminary, but we were good friends from then. Not only because we were schoolmates, but also because we worked on the yard at the seminary. We had the tractor and the truck and the shovels, and we did a lot of the landscaping work at the seminary. After that, we used to go, he was the resident advisor, so he had access to the keys. So we would get the keys and knock on each other's doors, about 5 of us, and we would go up to the chapel around 11:30, midnight, and we would go up there and do some private prayers for a while. This lasted for a good time, and that's when I considered monasticism, when we were doing that. And then along came Connie. So that's when our journeys diverted even further. He went up and became a monk. He was tonsured by Bishop Yakovos. I say bishop because he was bishop at that time, the one we call Little J. And then later he was ordained by Archbishop Yakovos, not to be confused with Little J. Ordained a deacon by him and released to go to St. Catherine's Monastery for his career as a monastic. He was ordained on Mount Sinai at St. Catherine's Monastery, so he is attached to the monastery, and that is always and will always be his home. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Father Makarios, who's going to offer a prayer and then give us a presentation. If you cannot see the screen because of glare or something like that, just adjust your seat a little bit. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, now and ever, to the ages of ages. Amen. Let us pray to the Lord.
Almighty God, our help and refuge, fountain of wisdom and tower of strength, to those that we can do nothing without your guidance and help, Assist us, we pray, and direct us to divine wisdom and power that we may accomplish this task and whatever we may undertake to do faithfully and diligently according to your will, so that it may profit to ourselves and to others, and to the glory of your name. For yours is the kingdom, power, and the glory of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, now and ever to the ages of ages. The first photo that we're looking at is a very good view of the monastery of St. Katherine in the Sinai Desert, in the Sinai Peninsula, which is now, since 1983, has been returned to the authority of the Egyptian government. The monastery of St. Katherine was not always called St. Katherine. The mother of St. Constantine, who was himself not a Christian at the time, as Emperor of Rome, his mother had an interest in developing Christian sites in what we call the Holy Land. She constructed a church in Jerusalem, and in her old age, she put some things together and arranged to have a chapel built in Sinai, at the foot of Mount Sinai. That was in the late 4th century. I'll get into that more later on if I have time to do so. Monastics, Christian monastics, appeared for the first time in the Sinai in the 3rd century. The first 2 monastics were husband and wife. That sounds like a conflicting issue, but it is not. They were, as husband and wife, and as monastics, did not share a life together in the Sinai. They lived separately in different places, and hardly if ever did they have any communication between one or the other of this couple. Their names were Saint Galaxion and Saint Episteme. Their feast day is celebrated on November 5th. We just had it just a couple of weeks ago. They were the first monastics in the Sinai. Now, what were they doing there? And your question may very well be, what's anybody doing there? Especially the Christian persuasion, so to speak. Well, we've looked, we haven't, but people have studied the origins of monasticism and have written things about the monastic life that help us and guide us and introduce us to the life of monasticism altogether. Orthodox monastics practice and do the same things as every other Orthodox monk or nun in any Orthodox monastery. We are not like the Roman Catholics, who have separate orders of monks and nuns. For example, all the Jesuits in the Catholic tradition are all priests. The majority of monastics in the Orthodox tradition are not ordained. It's necessary to have clergy serve the spiritual needs and the sacramental needs of the monastic community. So that's a small difference between East and West, so to speak. It turns out, from a demographic point of view, that monks originally, the first monastics, some of them, not all of them, but some of them had what we could call a questionable background as human beings. It's been discovered that many of the early monks, we're talking second, third, and fourth centuries, we're talking about a situation that existed a long time ago. But there were certain unlivable conditions within the framework of the Roman Empire. First of all, Christianity was outlawed. If you were a Christian in the Roman Empire, you were subject either to arrest or persecution. Constantine the Great fixed that eventually, finally, thankfully. But in order to avoid any pressure applied to you as a Christian and living within the context of the Roman Empire, with all of these legalisms thrown at you left and right, some of the first monastics had, let's call them colorful backgrounds. For example, some of the monks and nuns, primarily male monastics, were draft dodgers. In order not to be forced to serve in the Roman army, they would leave and they would go into the desert where they would not, most likely than not be found out and garnered or what have you, and taken back to serve in the Roman army. So draft dodgers, okay? Other class, tax evaders. People who didn't pay their taxes, and of course that was a necessary thing to do because it was supporting whatever that means in terms of the political structure. So, draft dodgers, tax evaders, and criminals, people who were subject to the law and facing incarceration. One very great example of a person who was a criminal, who is now a saint of the Orthodox Church. His name is Moses, the Ethiopian. He was the leader of a band of robbers. They killed people, they kidnapped people, they stole things, but he was enlightened because he came into contact with monastics themselves, and he learned from them that his life as a bad guy was over. Saint Galactium and Episteme, who came to the Sinai, they were in the class of people who were tax evaders. They were found out. Someone revealed to someone, and they were from Antioch, what is now Syria. The official government sent people, and actually, they didn't kidnap them, but they took them into custody in the Sinai and took them back to Antioch in order to face judgment. They were both martyred. They both died for their faith in Christ. And their bodies were brought back to the Sinai, and that's where their history began as far as the monastery is concerned. So these three classes of people, kinds of people like Moses and these two married people, this was the beginning of Orthodox Christian monasticism. Now, in Orthodoxy, we have three types of communities, of monastic communities. First are the hermits, people who live by themselves, who live away from everybody else. Maybe one or two other people may live with them or nearby them. No one understands clearly how effective, how numerous the monks were, people who became monastics in Egypt, along the Nile River, in the Sinai Desert, in the Transjordanian Desert, between Jerusalem and what is now the modern country of Jordan. One monastery outside of Jerusalem, the abbot of that monastery, whose name was George, had a following of 3,000 monastics. This is in the 4th and 5th century. It's a huge movement. Egypt was even more, monastics were even more numerous in Egypt and the Sinai, not much in the Sinai, but at least in the environment of that area. It was a huge movement. What caused the downfall or the diminution of monastic communities was raiders, brigands, teams of ne'er-do-wells attacking the monasteries and just annihilating people all over the place, thinking that there were treasures that they could steal or take for themselves. It effectively ended most of these large communities of monastics in the numbers of thousands. Incredible, actually. So the hermits was the first monastic movement. The paradigm, the example of Orthodox Christian monastic spiritual life is St. John the Baptist. He lived in the desert. He dressed very simply with simple clothing. He ate very simple food, and he was out there wandering around, telling people to be ready for the coming of the Lord. So we take the example, his lifestyle, as our own, and follow him as a model. The second level of monasticism, from the hermits, who are individuals basically, is called idiorhythmic. This means that monks are gathered together in communities, but they don't share common necessities. Each monk has his own dwelling, has his own way of getting financial support for himself and the people he may be working with. They only came together as a group for their daily prayers, and if and or when there was a divine liturgy. Usually, the monks were not ordained to be priests. If a monastery needed spiritual direction, guidance, and sacraments, they would go to a village and bring the village priest who was married to the monastery and to serve the spiritual needs of the community. So there were individuals, but they were not really cohesively collective as a group. But this is what they had, this independence one from another, and also they sort of separated themselves from normal, what would we imagine to be normal monastic life. The third level, the third tier are the Cenobitic monks. Kinovion is a Greek word, it means community. We have three guides in this movement. St. Pachomios, who was an Egyptian monk, gathered other monks in a community. They shared everything. St. Basil in Caesarea in Asia Minor. St. Sabas outside of Bethlehem. And St. Catherine's Monastery is another example of community-style monasticism. These are the three forms. And I explained the nature of the first beginnings of people who were attracted to monasticism. The draft dodgers, tax evaders, and criminals. This monastery was constructed by orders of the Emperor Justinian. His claim to fame as a historical figure, for every year that he was emperor, first of all, he moved the center of the empire from Rome to Asia Minor. Rome was a village with dirt streets and poverty. Constantine moved the empire east and built a city there, which he named after himself, Constantinople. For every year that Justinian, that was the 4th century. In the 6th century, Justinian became emperor, had a wife who was not Orthodox, by the way, until she was almost on her deathbed. For every year that Justinian was emperor in Constantinople in the 6th century, he built one church. So if he was emperor for 33 years, he built 33 churches in Istanbul, what is now called Istanbul and Constantinople. The monks in Sinai had heard of him. They were very careful about how they would manage to live their lives without too much interruption from bad guys. So they sent a delegation of monks to Constantinople, met with the emperor, and asked him for help in building them a secure place where they could be behind safe walls and secure walls and not have to worry too much about being harmed. This is what Justinian built in the 6th century. St. Hallam built a chapel there in the 4th century around the burning bush, which we'll see in a moment. Justinian's architect built this magnificent monastery as a military fortress. The people who came to work on the construction, 200 families, were all Christians from northern Greece and maybe from Romania, maybe somebody from Egypt. It's very hard to tell where these people came from. But they were experienced builders and they had some military training in case they had to take arms to defend the monks and themselves from bad guys. 23 years it took to build this monastery. Just FYI, it is the oldest Christian monastery in the world, which has never been closed, never been attacked, and never been ripped off. So whatever was brought there in the very beginning is still there, almost 1,500 years later. This treasure of the Orthodox Church is in the hands of 22 monks today. And you, some of you may have already been there, I'm not sure, you can ask, or you may know some people who have visited the monastery. To be part of that it gives you goosebumps, really. It's an amazing story. This monastery has survived. There's only one country, by the way, in the world that has been invaded militarily more than the Sinai. Sinai has seen over the centuries, since the time of the emperors, pharaohs of Egypt, 55 invasions. 55. The only other country with more invasions is Belgium. In Europe. More invasions there in that part of Europe than even in the Sinai. So with all of this turmoil, all of this upset, it's a little bit more difficult today because we are Christians living in a Muslim country. 90% of Egypt today population is Islamic. 10% is Christian. And Orthodox, capital O, Christians in Egypt are a very, very small number of the Christian population in the country. So we are a minority within a minority. But this edifice that you see here is offered to everyone and everyone who wants to come make the effort to make a trip there and to take away from their visit there something of the treasure of this monastery. So it's really a blessing in disguise, actually. This is where it all started. This is the burning bush. Moses stood in front of this bush. He was there in Sinai. First of all, Moses was born in Egypt. His mother, after he was born, put him in a waterproof cradle and put him in the Nile River. The Pharaoh's daughter, most likely Ramses II, who's a very well-known historical leader of the pharaonic in Egypt, was most likely Pharaoh. His wife, his daughter, was going to the river with her accompanied matrons, and they heard a baby crying. When they looked in the water, they found this baby in a cradle had been left there by its mother. The word Moses means he who was in the water. The daughter took the child in the cradle, and they realized that the kid was hungry. The kid needed to be nursed. So they went to the Jewish community who were enslaved for 400 years under the pharaohs and picked a woman who could be a nurse for the child. Guess what? It was his mother, not known to many people at the time. So his own mother nursed her own child. Well, he grew up in the household of the Pharaoh. If the Pharaoh died today, Moses, when he was an adult, would have been Pharaoh tomorrow. That's how close he was to the top. The Jewish slaves were being agonized, tyrannized, whatever, by the Pharaoh's armies. And one Jewish slave was injured by a soldier. Moses intervened and took the life of that soldier. Therefore, it was necessary for him to run away. He came to the Sinai. He was 40 years old. When he got to the Sinai, he found local indigenous people there, people who have been living in that area forever, actually. And he stayed. The tribal leader of this band of Bedouins, these nomads, his name was Jethro. Not the guy on TV, the real guy. Jethro had 7 daughters. One of the daughters caught Moses' eye. He married the girl and went to work as a shepherd for his father-in-law. Spent 40 years in the Sinai. Pharaoh's army could not find him. He was safe from being incarcerated, whatever. He stayed there for another 40 years. At the end of the 40 years, he went to this place. This bush was alive, and Moses was there 3,000 years ago. It's still alive and well today. Same plant, but it's just in a slightly different location now than it was when Moses was there 1,200 years before the birth of Christ. It's the only plant of its kind alive anywhere in the Sinai. Any attempt made to find a way to grow the plant, say even in laboratory conditions, has always failed. It will not grow anywhere but this one place inside this monastery. So St. Helen, the mother of Constantine, built a chapel around the bush at the time in the 4th century. But it was an open air enclosure, it didn't have a roof. Well, Moses, anyway, was there. The bush caught fire. If you had placed your hand in the bush, your hand would have burned because it was on fire. Then a voice came from the bush, and Moses said, "Who are you?" And the voice from the bush said, "I am he who is, all on." And you see these 2 letters making 3 words in the English language on the crown behind the head of our Lord, and almost every icon that portrays Christ. In other words, he's saying, "I am the God-man." And the voice continued, "You are in a holy place. Please remove your shoes." So Moses did. And then the voice said, "Go back to Egypt and bring those enslaved people with you, because it's time for them to leave." So after 400 years of slavery in Egypt, he went back, and then all the 7 plagues and all the other stuff that you read about in the Old Testament. And the Exodus began after that. But this is where it all started. The plant actually has a scientific name. and it's classified with all the botanical stuff. It has two cousins, by the way, one in South America, related to it somehow, and also in Saudi Arabia, but not like this plant is different. This is the well where Moses met his future wife, Zipporah. Sorry. This is a major source of water for the monastery. This is a desert climate. Recently, and I think in this past year, in 2021, a storm came through places like Alabama and Mississippi on the Gulf Coast and dropped 2 inches of water an hour. This monastery doesn't see 2 inches of rain in a whole year. Two things you will never see in the Sinai is running water like a creek or a stream and lakes. The other thing you'll never see a bedroom woman on a camel. They just don't do it. But here's where Moses met his future wife, Zipporah. Stayed in the area for 40 years. Afterwards, went back, began the Exodus, brought the Israelites to freedom, and the Exodus.
That one, Father, you're going to have to use for the thumbnail, sorry. That's the interior shot.
So when one of the first groups of monastics who went to the Sinai, part of their motivation was most of the other places that are related or sites are related to events that occurred either not in the Old. This is unique also in this monastery because sites here were settled. Old Testament sites were settled by Christian monks. Very unusual in that regard. Well, most other places, by then, the 4th century, 5th century, these sites were already occupied. There were already people there. So the monks wanted to find places where they could at least, I don't want to say enjoy, but live the life that they're called upon to live and not be bothered. And well, when they got to the Sinai, they found these indigenous people there, people who were Jethro's descendants, basically. And so when the monks were told, well, this is where the burning bush is, this is where the Israelites built the golden calf, this is where Moses struck a rock and drew water because people were clamoring for water and food. Without that instruction, they would have moved on, but they believed what they were told. Now, these people are illiterate. They do not read or write. So in order for them to sustain historically accurate information, the only means they had, and still have, by the way, is by telling stories. Most people who are here know this parlor game, where you form a circle, you whisper something in someone's ear, by the time I get back to you, it's a wholly different story than it was when I started. That didn't happen for these people. They had to maintain historical accuracy of what their ancestors went through, and until they finally had someone else they could tell it to, which was the Christian monks who were looking for these sites and didn't know where they were. They were shown by the local indigenous people where these sites were, and that's where they settled. Now, this is a far cry from what I said, was it last evening, or sometime recently here? It was last night at Vespers, where I said to the congregation, I have to end this. There's no reason for me to talk to you about any of this because the real Mount Sinai has been discovered in Western Saudi Arabia. That the place where we have lived now for almost 500 years is bogus. And these people are sure, these archaeologists who said they have discovered this area, is where the real Mount Sinai is. But that's not true, at least from my point of view, because of the influence that the monks had from the people who were telling them where these sites were located. and the fact that they settled there and believed firmly what they were told. So it's totally legitimate that they were not led astray, that they were told the truth. The rock that Moses struck to draw water because the Israelites were thirsty. Listen, I mean, look, if you look at the vision of it's just a stark, dry, hot place. So there are limitations on vegetation and especially water. But in the era of the Exodus, there were, the Old Testament says there were 600,000 men in the Exodus. Doesn't mention women and children or animals. So there were very likely 1 million people who needed to be fed, needed to have fresh water, and they were out there for 40 years. So they clamored for water. Moses took his rod and struck a huge boulder, 12 horizontal slash marks in the stone. And water gushed out, and it ran above ground for over 15 miles. Above ground, in the desert. That's how much water came from this rock. It satisfied the needs of the people that were clamoring. And the marks that were left in this stone have never been, no one has ever been able to identify how they were made. No mechanical instrument of any sort, no chisel or rock or sledgehammer or whatever. So all these miracles took place, and the local Bedouins who lived in this area forever, since Jethro and his descendants, always used to say that this mountain is special. Things happen here that don't usually happen in other places. And so they had a reverence for the mountain itself. They wouldn't graze their animals, for example, on this mountain. They have sheep and goats. They wouldn't build a house on the mountain, for example. So they had this reverence. And when Moses had this experience of the burning bush, number one, and other events that occurred, then it really began to make a lot of sense to people that this is, As I said earlier, the monastery of St. Katherine was saved from any kind of effort on the part of anyone else to abscond with or take away with them the treasures of the monastery. The three icons that you're looking at here are the oldest icons in the world. 4th, 5th, and 6th century. This is not paint that you see here. This is melted wax. It's called, the official name is encaustic. Very durable. Does not fade, doesn't go away, doesn't diminish at all. You're looking at paintings that are 1,400 years old or older even, two of them. And they look as fresh today as if they were painted in somebody's studio yesterday. Yes.
Can you tell us their size? How large are those?
A lot larger than what the picture shows. I don't have the exact measurements, but looking at the picture going from left to right, my left to your right, my left to right. First icon is an icon of the Virgin Mary, holding Christ in her lap, surrounded by two soldier saints, St. George and St. Theodore. If the picture were a bit clearer, you would notice that the the Virgin Mary's look is not straight out at you and I, it's to the left. But look at her right hand. Very subtly is she pointing her hand to Christ. This is a very common presentation in Orthodox iconography, but it started in the 4th century with this icon of the Virgin Mary. Also, again, it's not clear because it's a kind of clear picture, but the child doesn't look like an infant. It looks more mature than an infant might look at that particular age. So she's pointing to Christ, but she's looking away. Like it says, what it says is, don't look at me. I'm not the important person here. This is who you should be looking at. And she's pointing just carefully with her hand, pointing to Christ. Think of the wisdom that produced this icon and the other two as well. Absolutely incredible. You know, we Orthodox Christians need to be a little bit more, I'll use the word militant, when it comes to trying to explain who we are and where we come from. Historians are calling the Byzantine Empire the black hole of history. No one ever mentions, not never, but very rarely ever mentions anything about this incredible empire. Justinian built the church Hagia Sophia. He stood under the dome of that church when it was finished, 180 feet from the dome to the floor. He raised his arms, looked up into the heavens and said, Solomon, referring to the temple in Jerusalem, Solomon, I have outdone you. Magnificent. A minimum of decoration in that church, 40,000 pounds of silver, candles, vestments, chalices, also 40,000 pounds. Oh, where is it? Where's this stuff today? God only knows. When the ruler of Russia, Vladimir, was looking for a religion for his people, he sent emissaries all over the world, checked into Buddhism, checked into the Roman Catholic situation, the Vaticans and all that stuff. He went and sent everywhere. Finally, he was told, there's one place you haven't been. You haven't been to Constantinople. Send your emissaries there. When his emissaries were led into the church of Hagia Sophia in the 9th century, I believe, end of the 9th century, they said, we went into that church, we did not know whether we were in heaven or on earth. So dramatic, so beautiful was that church. There were 150 priests assigned to that church having services daily. That's how busy the place was. Absolutely incredible. The Byzantine Empire lasted over 1,000 years. You know that the economy, the value of Byzantine coinage never lost its value in 1,000 years? How did that happen? And how come no one's talking about that under these circumstances that we see every day in front of ourselves in the modern day? Things like that. The Byzantines, by the way, had 3 secrets to keep themselves safe and not have to deal with invasion. They married off their princesses to guys who were going to do harm to them, so that they had the family in the palace in Germany or someplace, less likely to invade because their father wants his daughter married to his daughter. They married off their princesses. They stole from the Chinese silkworms. Don't forget, royal families have to dress the part, and they were using silk, but they stole silkworms from the Chinese and created their own market for their own product, basically. And the third secret was what they called Greek fire, a sort of a flamethrower. If enemy ships came into the harbor where Constantinople was and wanted to do harm, Byzantines would send their ships out, and they had a way of firing this mechanism that would shoot fire and burn the ships that had come there to harm them. We do not know until this very day what was in that stuff. Greek fire. So they had these three secrets, and it worked most of the time to keep enemies away and to maintain peace in the empire. Truth be told, 1453, when the empire fell, the Turks, the Ottomans, had some help. They had gunpowder, which the Byzantines knew nothing about, and they had Chinese mercenaries who helped them over the walls of the city. And they finally fell, 1453. That's another story. These icons, hold it. We only got past one icon, I got two more to go. The icon on the far, on your right, is St. Peter the Apostle. 5th century icon. And you can always tell if you don't know, if you're looking at an icon and you don't know what the story is that's being told to you. We'll explain more when we see St. Katherine later. If the person in the depiction is shown holding a cross, it means that person was martyred. So you see St. Peter holding the cross. It's like a staff, a wooden staff, but there's a cross on it. And also you can't see because it's not a clear picture, but he's also holding the keys to the kingdom. 5th century. And the icon of icons is this magnificent portrait of Christ, the ruler of the world. Pantokrator is the name in Greek. It's a magnificent icon. Now, you haven't asked, but I'll tell you. How did the person know what Christ looked like in order to paint his adult features? Anybody want to make a guess? The so-called Shroud of Turin. There's an image on that piece of cloth that is believed to be the cloth that wrapped the body of Christ before he was put in the tomb. The cloth is now in the city of Turin in Italy, but it started out near in the Middle East. The story is, well, it's evident from iconographic history. No one before the 6th century realized that Christ could be portrayed as an adult. Every image of Christ before the 6th century portrayed him in symbolic ways: a lamb, a ship, a boat, an anchor, things like a bunch of grapes, things like that. No one knew what he looked like. But when the shroud was found by Byzantine soldiers on the shore of the Black Sea, that's where it had been taken 500 years before. They brought the shroud, what we call the shroud today, back to, for safekeeping, back to Constantinople. And artists, for the first time in history, were able to draw an adult image of Christ from what they took off the prototype on the so-called shroud. It's a phenomenon. Now, modern science has placed this icon, or the representation of the icon, over the image on the shroud. In the legal world, if someone breaks into your house and leaves fingerprints around, and the police go afterwards and investigate the crime, they will take pictures of fingerprints. The FBI lab in Washington, D.C. has millions of these fingerprints left by criminals. It only takes 4 or 5 similarities between what they found in the house that was broken into and what's on record in Washington. 5 will convict a robber. When they did that with this this icon of Christ, they superimposed the icon on the shroud. You know what they found? Over 20 similarities, making it almost doubtless that this is original, that the image on the shroud is the image of Christ after he was wrapped in the shroud and buried in the tomb. Phenomenal. Also, again, it's not really clear on the picture you're looking at, but this icon was painted at a time in the history of the church where the church was battling heresies. And so the artist who portrayed this image wanted to show the two natures of Christ. He was both human and divine at the same time, both nature but separate. I know that sounds confusing, but that's the argument, or the principle. So if you look carefully, the eyes are not equal. One shows his divinity, and the other eye shows his humanity. And when did the Lord show his humanity and his divinity at the same time? The raising of Lazarus. Most prominently, that event showed his divinity and his humanity at the same time. But this artist who painted this image showed that in the face of Christ. These icons were not painted in the Sinai. They were brought there by pious people. Again, they're very... Now, why? Keep in mind, we know about the iconoclastic controversy. It lasted 143 years. I said when I began my remarks, the monastery has never been plundered. Everything that is there is still there from the time it was ever taught there or produced there. And that's the story. So the monastery of St. Katherine does not celebrate the Sunday of Orthodoxy, the first Sunday of Lent. Why? Because we never had the problem of the iconoclasts coming to do their destruction. Had these icons existed, and in other places, they would have been. I mean, it was a very effective. The damage done by the icon was across the board. It was really very, but it didn't happen in the same. We're looking at one page of the Gospel of St. John in the Greek language, dating to the 4th century. It's the oldest known copy of the Bible, complete, Old and New Testament. This is one page only. It's not written on paper, it's written on parchment. Parchment is animal skin. If you notice carefully, it's all capital letters, called uncials in official language. Also, there is no separation between the words. There is no ending of sentences and beginning of paragraphs in this Bible. Why is this important? It's the oldest known copy of the Bible, Old and New Testament. So we come now to the 16th century, and close to our time, in Rome. The Pope of Rome ordered his scholars, England, pardon me, King of England, James, I want to say the first, I think maybe, wanted the Bible in the English language. So he had his scholars come, and they translated from Greek and other languages into English for the first time, almost the first time, not completely. But in my opinion, the King James Version of the Bible is not a good translation. It's full of errors. And the reason is very simple. If you look at this one page You don't see any marks, you don't see any footnotes, you don't see anything in the columns that says anything about who was studying this text. And virtually, persons back in the day were studying that they had maybe one or two more other sources that we're looking at and making note of the differences, if there were any, between the one I'm reading and the one that I'm looking at. And they would make the differences known by writing in the margins or as footnotes. King James's scholars only used sources as early as the 8th century. This is forced. The earlier you go back, the less likely the document is to be being corrupted. Very simple. They didn't know this gospel existed in the Sinai in England at the time. So we say that the version of the Bible in English that they produced in England is not reliable because there are many errors in that, unfortunately. There are two other Bibles as old as this, not as old as this, but same. One is called the Alexandrian, and the other one is called the Vatican. This is the oldest book now in possession. The Bible you just saw in Greek, most of it was ripped off. I said before, we were never traumatized by people who did bad things. It ended up in Germany and Russia and England. This is now the oldest book in the library of the monastery. The language is Syriac. Syriac is another name for Syriac is Aramaic, which is the language that Christ spoke with his disciples. This book is over 1,500 years old. Now, it's also called a palimpsest. Palimpsest is a Greek word which means that there was an underwriting that was erased and something else was written over the original. People did that in those days because vellum or parchment very expensive. The most expensive parchment, you know what the source was? Unborn calf. And of course, it's not paper, it's parchment. So the underwriting was erased, and this was written over it. And nobody knew about this till the 1890s. So what was underneath that was erased? And what are we looking at in this picture here? The underwriting was the 4 Gospels in this language. And the overwriting that we're seeing here is the lives of the saints from the 5th century. Okay, where are we? We're under a major reconstruction project right now in the library. The librarian, as we speak, is on a plane heading for the States. He left Cairo this morning. And he's been raising money to upgrade the library in the monastery and to make things more secure and much safer than it would be without this help. So he's on a mission to do that goodness for the monastery. He has a lot of help. But here is a look at the modern library that is now functional in Monastery of St. Katherine. There are 3,500 handwritten manuscripts. Second largest collection of handwritten books in the world. Number 1 is the Vatican. And if you were to ask why are there so many Greek texts in Rome, mostly because of the Crusades. Mostly because of the Crusades. So these are specially built cabinets that are supposed to minimize dust and critters and what have you. And but it's being improved and upgraded all the time because it's necessary to do that. And every page of every book in the library has been digitalized. So hopefully in the future, if scholars want to look at some ancient texts, all they have to do is get into our program stay home wherever they came from and not come and bother us at the monastery. So this is like the reading room. It's climatized. By the way, the reason for all this preservation in the monastery, icons and books and so forth, is because of the dry climate. The humidity very rarely ever goes above 10% on a yearly basis. So it's naturally conducive for preservation purposes. But now, these days, there's a huge population push. Egypt is now a country of 100 million souls. Every 5 minutes, there's a birth in Egypt. Every 9 months, the population increases by 1 million people. And the government is desperate to find room for these people. And the Sinai is about the only place in the country these days that could possibly support population. So they're making huge efforts now. But it's affecting the climate in the monastery, especially when it comes to preservation, like the books and the icons. This is what you see when you climb Mount Sinai. A monastery is at the foot of Mount Sinai, 5,000 feet elevation. The top of Mount Sinai is 7,500 feet. So when you climb up there, there's a church on top of the summit, which is dedicated to the Holy Trinity. And in the beginning, the church covered the entire summit. It was huge. But time has a way of wearing things down. And there are several earthquakes that happened that caused destruction to the church. It was rebuilt for the last time in 1935. But when you climb early in the morning before sunrise. It's a 2.5 hour hike. And you wait there for the sun to rise, which is what you're seeing in this picture here. Absolutely stunning. This is not Mount Sinai. This is the top of the mountain called St. Katherine. It's 8,700 feet elevation. St. Katherine was martyred in Alexandria. In those days, executions were public events. You all need to know that there's a movement ongoing here in America for these TV channels that are hooked into whatever the internet is and so forth. They want to publish, not to publish, but to show, to demonstrate executions in prisons, live and in color. That's the way it was in these days. Catherine was 18 years old when she was beheaded in Alexandria. And it was a public event. Everybody went. Everybody watched this horrible thing happen. But the body disappeared from the site of the execution. There's a church there. You know, we have this tradition in Orthodoxy that churches were built on the site where the saints were martyred. St. George, St. Catherine, St. Nicholas, St. Demetrius. And when a church is consecrated, here in the state, a new church is built and consecrated, we put relics of the martyrs and seal them inside the altar of the church. In fact, Father Milton told me that the martyrs of Sinai, their relics have been sent here to this church when this church was consecrated. So you have a connection now with this Sinai because of the saints who are now embedded in the altar table of your own church. Incredible. Well, this is St. Catherine, 18 years old, beheaded by order of her father. If you look carefully at the icon and just look at some of the details, you notice number one, this is not simple clothing. She was an aristocrat. Her family was very high up in the government of Rome. Her father was a very responsible person. He was scandalized when his daughter told him that she had become a Christian. Her name before she was baptized was Dorothea. When she was baptized, when introduced to Christianity, we believe by disciples of St. Anthony the Great of Egypt, her mother also came to Christianity. Angered her father. He ordered her imprisoned and ultimately ordered her execution. So we see her left hand is over on the far left side. Her hand is resting on the wheel. The wheel is embedded with sharp spikes, knives actually. That she was tortured on that wheel. The wheel fell apart, and the knives rolled out and injured the people who were there who were supposedly applying this horrible torture to this poor young girl. The feather in her other hand demonstrates her wisdom. She was a bright kid. The emperor sent 50 philosophers to Alexandria to test her, to get her to change her mind from being a Christian back to paganism. It failed. She convinced all 50 of these philosophers, and they became Christians and were ultimately martyred themselves. We commemorate them on the same day, on the 25th of November. And you see over her left shoulder is the mountain. What if she died in Alexandria? What's she doing in Sinai? Thousands of kilometers away from her. Her body disappeared from the site of the martyrdom. There's a church there now. It's been there forever. But the body had disappeared. One of the monks, a monk, came to live in Sinai and was visited in a dream and was told, if you climb the highest mountain here, you will find there, on top of this mountain, the body of St. Catherine. He did what was instructed. They found the body and brought it back to the monastery. 9th century, 500 years after she died. Body was completely intact. Her head was severed, of course, but otherwise completely intact. So I haven't given you an opportunity to ask questions. I know I said a lot, we've covered a lot of territory, but it's just the beginning. But I wanted to show you this last picture before we take a Q&A. This is what the church looks like inside. It's the main church of the monastery, called the Catholicon. The monastery, when the monastery was first settled by Christian monks, named the monastery after the Virgin Mary in the 4th century. There was a connection between the burning bush and the birth of Christ. The bush burned, it wasn't consumed. So too the Virgin Mary gave birth and still remained in a state of virginity. So the connection existed between this Old Testament event and the reality of the coming of Christ through the burning bush. So it was known as the monastery of Virgin Mary. In the 6th century, when the monastery was built, and this magnificent mosaic that we flashed by a couple of times on the screen here, the monastery's name was changed from the Virgin Mary to Transfiguration. The Emperor Justinian knew the Bible, so to speak, and knew that Moses and Elias, the prophets from the Old Testament, visited Christ on Mount Tabor. So he knew that connection existed. And Moses and Elias both came to the Sinai. Moses first, and 500 years later, the prophet Elias, after he killed the priest of Balaam, was being hunted down by Jezebel, etc., etc. And then when the body of St. Catherine was found in the 9th century, the name was changed again. But the church is still Transfiguration. We celebrate the burning bush on on March 25th, the nativity, the Annunciation of the birth of the Christ. And of course, St. Catherine's feast day, which is coming up this year on the 25th of November, which is on the calendar this year, Thanksgiving. But this is what the church looks like. These are all oil lamps that are lit for the feast of Pascha. And this is, when you walk into this church with all of this artificial light, it's another world, absolutely. So on behalf of the abbot of the monastery, who's an archbishop, and the brothers who I'm here representing, thank you for your time and your attention. And he and they and all of us wish all of you well for the upcoming feast days that are approaching. And also the blessings of St. Catherine to all of you in hope that tomorrow is a better day than today. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Father Makarios in particular. This is a prelude to your pilgrimage to Mount Sinai. And I'll put that on your bucket list. We are going to take some time for questions and answers. It's 2:00 now, so we understand if you do feel like you need to leave, but those who wish to stay, my favorite part of a presentation is always the Q&A. So feel free, we can stay. The church is going to be open until you're all done talking. Before we get to that, I do want to say one more word of thanks to the Legionnaires Men's Fellowship, the Legionnaires of St. Demetrius. They coordinated and organized this event. Waleed is the president of the Legionnaires. The group also includes Mike Thompson, Alex, pronounce his last name, Tom Coghill, and Nick Lahikis, who donated this 82-inch screen that you haven't seen before, Jim Agnew, Daniel Agnew, and we're welcoming new members of the Men's Fellowship anytime. So we want to recognize them, and we want to thank Nick for the donation. Now, since I know you, I will go ahead and take questions and pass the, I won't do the answers, but I'll take the questions. Tom.
So the letter that Muhammad wrote,
Yes.
can you talk about the letter that Muhammad
Yes.
wrote?
There are two stories. The question is, how has the monastery managed to stay protected all this time without any damage or destruction or thievery? Muhammad died in 632 AD. The monastery was finished, the construction was finished in 545, excuse me. So almost 100 years lapsed between the end of the construction of the monastery and the death of Muhammad the Prophet, and this new religion came about. By the way, the fastest spreading religion of any sort by anybody in history. Started in what is now Saudi Arabia and went all the way to Spain in less than 100 years. The monks realized that there could be a threat to them. There are two stories, two versions of the same story. One is that Muhammad's parents died. And in that area, the custom was, and it may still very well be, and even we have done this as our ancestors. When your parents die and you're young, you are given to one of your relatives to be raised as their own child. So this, in case of Muhammad, was his uncle, who was a merchant. He had a business of sending camel caravans out to bring stuff back and forth to Mecca in what is now Saudi Arabia. So he put the kid to work. Legend is that he came to the Sinai with a caravan of camels. Now the monks, they practice two things. I always get one of them messed up, I have to read this. Monks always do two things, and they do it very well. One is hospitality, philoxenia. Hang on. Simple. Philoxenia and philanthropia. Hospitality and friendship. They don't ask, what religion are you? What are you doing here? This is a desert climate. This is a monastery that its outreach is phenomenal. But when you go there, the monks assume that you have some needs, either yourself or the people with you, or even the animals had to be fed and watered. The camel, it's a huge caravan. So some people believe that Muhammad was working on his uncle's caravan route, and one of those routes took them to the Sinai. And they stopped at the monastery and received hospitality and friendship from the monks. This is before he became what he ended up to be, as it were. So when this new religion started, he realized there was automatic animus between this new religion of Islam and Christianity. And he realized that he had received such good treatment from the monks, he remembered that he was treated well and wanted to reciprocate. So he issued a letter of protection to the monastery in writing, but he couldn't read and write. He was illiterate. His nephew wrote the letter of protection. One legend. The letter is called in Greek Antiname. In English, it means firman, a letter of immunity from, an immunity covenant, written in 623 AD. Exempted the monks from military service and taxation. This is huge. You became a Christian, you became a Muslim because you couldn't pay your taxes, which is one incentive, whatever religion you might have been, to change and become Muslim. The letter, the Firman, Atiname, advises Muslims to assist the monks and threatens Muslims with damnation if they interfere with the monastery or the pilgrimage routes to the monastery by pilgrims. That's one legend. The other legend is that the monks themselves went to Mecca, met with the prophet, and worked out a deal with him, and brought the letter back to the monastery with them. So important is this document. It saved the monastery. Well, we believe that St. Catherine's protection overall is the protection that is all that's needed, but certainly this letter from Muhammad has helped. And only one Islamic leader about 1,000 years ago ignored what this Firman says, surrounded the monastery with his troops, and he hated anything that was Christian. And his whole duty in life was destroy anything having anything at all to do with Christianity. And he brought his army to the monastery. They gave the monks 3 days to leave. The abbot had a meeting with the brotherhood and said, we have to do something because we're not leaving. They refitted the dining room of the monastery into the prayer house, prayer room, if you will, the Muslims use for their prayers. So now there's no dining room anymore, it's a thing. The bell tower was retrofitted as a minaret. The army went away, they came back in 3 days. This is the true part of the story, by the way. They came back after 3 days, they're ready to tear the place apart. They saw the minaret, they saw the mosque, and the Caliph said, these guys must be our friends. Let's not bother them. Packed up and went away. It was because of a letter that Muhammad issued. That letter has been reissued many times by many historical figures. Number one, Napoleon Bonaparte. Number three, Golda Meir, the former prime minister of Israel. Lots of people have followed the letter of Muhammad. This is the kind of place that we live in over there. This is the method that we have in order to tell people this is how we want to get along with everybody, to get along with everybody else. So those two, one of those two, well, either one or both, who knows if either one is actually accurate, but either he came and didn't come, or they went and appealed to him and he sent the letters. Is that good enough?
Father, thank you so much for your talk. We've had reports in the U.S. that ISIS has shown threats against the monastery. Could you speak to that? Is that true or not true?
I'm being thoughtful for a moment because I don't want to appear to be saying anything that could mess somebody up. I don't know of the report that you're mentioning. I know that the monastery is under the thumb of the Egyptian government and its authorities. They would like to see us gone. They don't see any reason for us to be there after all this time, despite the letter of Muhammad, despite the history of the place, and despite the good nature of the monastics. But again, philoxenia, hospitality, and friendship. They don't understand that. So we're doing a balancing act, actually. All of us, except the abbot, are guests in Egypt. All of us have visas that allow us to stay in the country beyond what you get when you go to the airport and get a 30-day pass to stay in the country. All of us have that designation. If they want to make trouble for us, all they have to do is cancel everybody's visa and we're gone. We're doing our best to keep a very open and healthy relationship with the government because there are overlords at this point. And so far, we've done pretty well. Things always get dicey from time to time. They're always trying to find ways to get into our business, so to speak. And there's not much that we can do about that because we're a small group. But the monastery is an incredibly powerful place, by the way. And it's because of not the notoriety is a bad word to use in this case. It's because of the history of the monastery and its ability to maintain a presence in a very difficult world. And if the rest of the world, especially in the Middle East, could see what relationship this monastery has developed with its neighbors, the Middle East would be a lot different place today. That's one of the messages that I sent to you and that the monastery represents to the world. And we have a little help. We have the letter from Muhammad, of course. Very helpful. Well, the Turks gave it in 1517 to the monastery. The Sultan's name was Selim I. His nickname was the Grim. He took the original letter that was in the monastery since 623 AD. He took that letter, the original, back to Turkey with him, back to Istanbul, what is now Istanbul. You know the story of Istanbul? It's very simple. After 1453, the Ottoman Turks couldn't pronounce Constantinople. not the word. But everybody knew the city. Everybody in the world. It was a population of 1 million people, streetlights, paved streets, flush toilet. I mean, but they knew the word for city in Greek, polis. So Istanbul means Constantinople, the city, and it can be pronounced in the Turkish language easily, instead of saying Constantinople. That's the story. So we have this ability, which is a blessing really, to keep the peace, as it were, with our neighbors, and we work very hard to keep that going for us, because it's only helpful for us, not harmful, really.
I can talk loud.
Let me use the mic. Some people are back there.
Father Makarios, I'm curious about the languages that are spoken inside the monastery. Obviously, it's a Greek Orthodox monastery, so liturgy is in Greek, but I'm sure, how many languages? What do we hear there?
As we speak today, the beginning of the 21st century, there are 5 monks in the monastery today whose first language is English. I'm a Greek American. That doesn't mean much to people, but they're confused with that. So they expect me, because I say Greek, that I know the Greek language. But my first language is English. My second language is Greek. And of course, all the generations that have gone on before I have got there, the monks had to learn the language of their occupiers. Otherwise, they would have a very hard time trying to maintain, again, peace and quiet. I was first there in 1976. The area of the Sinai was Israeli occupied territory. The language we had to use to deal with the Israelis was Hebrew. I learned Hebrew. Just because all the monks did, because we had to learn how to speak with these people. Arabic came in 1983 when the Sinai was finally turned back to Egypt. The library of the monastery has volumes in at least 5 or 6 languages. What does that mean? That means that there were times in the history of this monastery where there were monks in the monastery who could read, write, and understand those particular languages, and they're very ancient texts. There's a huge movement now on the part of the library and the monastery to tell people that Arabic is not an Islamic language. It's not exclusively Islamic. We have documents in the library of the monastery in Arabic that predate Islam by centuries, which is phenomenal if you think about it. But there were monks there, and there are now, who are not Greek speakers, first language wise. So, and the library has these texts in these various languages: Slavonic, Georgian, Arabic. You name it, it's there. Does that help you?
It does, thank you.
Let me give it a shot.
Speaking?
Hi, Father. Given the manuscripts and the historic nature and the nature of the site, does it have any UN status as a UN heritage site, or has it tried to apply for that? So I was just wondering, how is it looked at by the United Nations?
The monastery of St. Catherine was designated a World Historical Site in 1985. We've had that coverage now for 3 decades, maybe more, slightly more. UNESCO has been very helpful in defending the monastery with some of the changes that are being attempted to be applied to the life of the monastery. They've been very helpful about that. They lost a battle recently on our behalf, but I won't get any further than that. We can talk about it privately. So again, it's a balancing act between what the monastery is, what the Greek Orthodox Church is, and how we deal with our neighbors. And we try to be open about it, we try to be understanding, and we try to be flexible. If we don't, then we're pushing ourselves in the wrong direction.
Hi, Father. How did you, an American, come to be a monastic on Mount Sinai?
Why not Brooklyn?
Why not marry? No laughs. St. John of the Ladder. In the almost the first paragraph of chapter 1, on the ladder of divine ascent, asks that very question. He was asked by a novice. The novice asked him, "What is a monk?" John thought about it, only for 2 or 3 seconds. It didn't take him long to give an answer. He said, "I don't know what monks are. I only know that I have seen them." Phenomenally wise response. It takes some thought to understand where he was coming, what he was trying to say. But in that same paragraph, in the first chapter of his book on the Ladder of Divine Ascent, he said there are 3 reasons why a person enters a monastery. 1, love of God. 2 is to be sorry for mistakes you made in your life. And number 3, you want to be with God in paradise. Each and every one of us has those same thoughts and has those same desires. So what's the difference between you as a layperson and me heading for a monastery in the middle of the Sinai desert? None whatsoever. St. Anthony never left his monastery in Upper Egypt. He left twice. He left once to defend the Orthodox faith against the heretics, and someone came to him and told him there was a shoemaker in Alexandria that was more pious and more humble than he was. It got under his skin. It bothered him because he'd been 20 years where he was, and he was being stung by mosquitoes and whatever. He walked to Alexandria, found the shoemaker, and he said, "I've heard a lot about you. I thought I was doing the right thing. I came to see what your secrets are, not secrets, but your behavior is." He said, "It's very simple. I work to provide for my family, food on the table, a roof over our heads, etc., etc." And he said, "I think only good things about people." He maintained his humility by saying that. St. Anthony bent over and kissed his feet and said, "You're absolutely right," and went back to the monastery. There's a lesson there. The lesson is you don't have to be a monk to be a holy person. You can do that. It takes time and it takes teaching and it takes a lot of determination, obviously. So again, am I wasting my time by doing what I'm doing, where I do it, where I choose to do that? The monastery of St. Katherine is a huge draw from that point of view. To invite people to go there, not only to visit, but to stay and take part in the monastic life itself. But the lesson from the shoemaker is also out there in front of everyone, telling the average everyday person, you can do this. So the lesson is, as the Father said, where there's a Christian, there must be an ascetic, someone who's doing spiritual work. We passed out over Friday and Saturday this little handout that we had. It talks about how to be a better person. we're encouraged to do 4 things: prayer, fasting, watchfulness, vigilance, and charity. And we don't get to choose. We have to do all 4. They're called virtues. Audit this. Prayer, fasting, watchfulness, or vigilance, and charity. If we do all 4 of those things, the gates of paradise will be open to us. If we try to do just 1 or 2, or not at all, then the work is cut out for us. But that's why it was a handout that we gave to people in the last 2 days. Where there's a Christian, there must be an ascetic. But the shoemaker also points that the life of an average person can be benefited, as well as the monastics themselves.
Why St. Catherine's? Why St. Catherine's and not Mount Athos or some other monastery? I know the answer, just answer people.
Why not a monastery somewhere else other? We had dreams at one point, myself and another monastic, to have a house of our own, as it were, in the States, and I had to travel 8,000 kilometers to a strange country to try and live out the monastic life. Well, that never happened, unfortunately, both because we were not making wise decisions in those days. But I had a preference for not being in a Greek-speaking environment. But the reality is different, because all the monks in the monastery are from Greece, not all of them, most of them. They all speak Greek. The language of the liturgy and the services are all in the Greek language. So it was self-defeating in that sense, to think that way. But there's something else. Two things get better when they're walked on: Persian carpets and the church. I've said this in sermons from the pulpit in many parishes I visited, not this, but over the years. And I tell people this story. You have no fear in this country worshiping any way you like, regardless of whoever you are. The gendarmes are not going to march in and break the door down, march in and haul the priest off to jail someplace because of what he says or does. That doesn't exist here. So we have become very comfortable in our lives. What we need to do is raise our level of challenge, because it's hard for us to be comfortable. You know what I tell people? I'm the sand in your shorts at the beach. Just as an irritation to try and get people to be moved a bit, just a bit. Change your position from here today to there tomorrow. And that can be done anywhere, in any monastery, if it's a good monastery and a good environment in the monastic, within the community itself. And there are good monasteries, and they're not so good in some cases. But I chose Egypt. Again, it was a challenge for me to learn to live my faith in a country that was hostile to Christianity, first of all, which was not the case when I was here in the States, serving parishes and whatever else I was doing. Instead of being more comfortable in an environment where that is less apt to occur. So I went to Egypt in 1976. So.
Not to go back.
Use your outside voice.
It's nice to meet you, Father. My name's Ben. Not to go back so much to the conversation about the Islam and its effects on the monastery, but you get there at 76. Were there differences with the territorial exchanges between Egypt and Israel, with how you were treated, or how the monastery was treated during the 60s and 70s?
there's a difference in the outlook or mentality. Most modern-day Israelis have come from European societies, where they learn conventions and business and other things according to a Western point of view, mindset. It was far easier for us as a community of Christian monastics, when we needed to get something done, to deal with these people because they understood. You're talking their language, you're talking theirs, they're talking yours. Just from the point of view of again, just conventions, basically, and language, but also administratively. When we had trouble trying to refit ourselves from an Israeli influence with the language, etc., to now an Arabic, Egyptian environment. Meaning we had to stop using Hebrew and start using Arabic, just to talk with our friends and do business for the monastery. But culturally, it's a different place. It's a different place altogether. And Islam is very, it has a certain hold on the way people see themselves from a mindset point of view. A lot different than what the Israelis what we had to deal with when we worked with the Israelis. Does that help?
I think so, yes. The question begs, which was more comfortable for, who was benefited, which benefited the monastery better? I know it's not a question, but it's on my mind.
If I could, and maybe you can just say nay, Aki. From what you said earlier, it seems like the perceived threat is greater under Islam than any threat under Israel. Is that a fair statement?
Brother Milton's right. The parameters are different. The mindset that we had to deal with the Israelis was totally different than what we had to deal with when we had to learn how to weave our way through Egyptian mindset. Because they want everybody to be a Muslim. Either you're a Muslim or you're dead, period. So there's always that challenge. They're not going to affect the life of the monks in the monastery with that point of view, but that's where they're coming from. The Israelis, administratively, they were tough. But, again, just dealing with them on a very simple level of just getting permission to stay in their country as foreigners. It's a lot harder to do that in Egypt. But we have people working with us on our side that make it a little bit easier to navigate some of these issues. But still, the threat is there. That they want everyone to be a Muslim. Their mindset is very simple. As soon as everybody in the world converts to Islam, all the problems will cease. There'll be no more animosity, no more trouble from anybody, no more ups and downs. Everything will be just, hunky-dory, using my 60s language. Israelis are a bit different than that. Again, they have a European mindset. It's much easier for us to do with them on a business level, which we do every day of the week. And it was I thought it was easier. I found it easier to deal with them on that level for myself personally. And I think the monastery did too at the time.
I think we'll take two more questions.
Father, do you have very many Coptic visitors? And the second part of the question, in your trove of archives and so on, do you have many documents, old works and so on, that would pertain to the Coptic orientation?
Of the thousands of pages of documents in the monastery library, I think, I could be wrong, I'll say it anyway if I am wrong. One Coptic volume in a library of thousands of texts. The Coptic church is alive and well. It's difficult for them because, well, just because they're Christians in an Arabic. Not all Arabs are not Muslims. Not all Muslims are Arabic. Egyptians are not Arabs, but they were forced to learn Arabic because Islam says that that the language of the Quran will become twisted if it's taken out of context and tried to be translated in other languages. So that all the imams, when they yell from the minaret, they're in Arabic. So everybody knows Arabic. The Coptic Church is not that way at all. They, as a communicating source for doing business and so forth, they're Arabic. But what language do they use in their liturgy? They use some Greek, believe it or not, and they use the language of the pharaohs. Saint Anthony the Great heard the gospel when his parents took him to church when he was a kid. He heard the gospel in Egyptian. Well, they were speaking Arabic in those days. So he knew, and people would come and ask him questions, visitors, and he would say, I need someone to translate for me because I don't speak Greek. So Arabic was not a known language at the time, but the Coptic church, which is the indigenous Christian population of the country, was forced, as was the country as a whole, no longer use the Pharaonic language. So their language is gone. You want to be scared or bothered or I just put out as a thought. The United States will not be an English-speaking country one of these days. It will not. The same thing happened in Egypt. The Egyptians had their own language. The Christian Church of Egypt, called the Coptic Orthodox, with a small O in my view, did use the Pharaonic language, and they're still a remnant of that in their liturgy. They don't have a good relationship with us. They're the 500-pound gorilla in the room, as it were. They've got all the authority, and they look at us and say, well, you're only a few thousand Orthodox Christians, Greek Orthodox, as it were, and we're 25 million. So who are you? And they would love, if they were able to take possession of the monastery for them as one of their own. They would love to do that. They'd be fighting the Egyptian government, number one, to do that. And also our patriarchate in Jerusalem would be standing in line for that too, as it were. That's another story.
Father, you shared with us that there were regular pilgrims coming to the monastery. I was just wondering if you could share any kinds of miracles that have occurred on the holy lands of the monastery.
The first and foremost miracle is the fact that the body of St. Catherine was never corrupted. Flesh and bones are still on the body. And when the relics are opened for veneration, this amazing fragrance comes out of the reliquary. Sometimes it comes out by itself without anybody doing anything to generate it. Sometimes it comes out because we're venerating this great saint of the church. Miracles happen all the time. One small example. Back in the day, many, many centuries ago, the monks ran out of food in the monastery. The abbot said, we have to leave. We can't stay. We have no more. We can't feed ourselves. We're stuck. We're leaving. Get pack all your stuff, and I'm going to go up Mount Sinai for the last time, say my prayers, and when I come back, we're out of here. On his way back down the mountain, he was stopped on the trail by the Virgin Mary. She said, where are you going? He said, well, the monks are out of food. We can't stay here anymore. We have to leave. She said, you're not going anywhere. So what do you mean? She said, go back to the monastery and you will see. When he got down the mountain, he found outside the monastery a caravan of 700 camels, bringing food and all the necessity that the monks needed in order for them to stay put. So on that narrow trail, on that mountain, on the way up to that mountain, there's a small chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary because of the miracle that occurred there. One example. It happens all the time. Sometimes we feel comfort about talking about these things. Other times we sort of say, well,
Okay, thank you all for, I would like to say the patience of Moses, but let's say the patience of Job. Wishing you all a very happy Thanksgiving. This year on Thanksgiving, remember that it is also the feast of St. Catherine on the same day. We won't be having liturgy that morning. We'll be helping Connie prepare the turkey and stuffing and other parts of our meal. But when you say your prayers before your meal, also remember St. Catherine and all the monks of St. Catherine, the abbot, Archbishop Damianos, and Father Makarios and his brotherhood there. And you know, they also have not just the monks inside the monastery, but there's a village around there and there's a lot of dependencies. So it's not just the monastery per se, but the monastery and the environs. And that is, in case you didn't know, I don't know if you mentioned it or not, it is the smallest yet autocephalous Orthodox Church. Just like the much larger Church of Russia or the Church of Greece, it is an autocephalous church headed by an archbishop. Let's all stand and say our departing prayers. Let us depart in peace, praying to the Lord. We ask, O Lord, your blessings upon this community of St. Demetrius, the sister community with the monastery and community of St. Catherine. May we be bonded in a love and filial relationship, not only today, but throughout our time, through our prayers and our love for one another. We ask, O Lord, your blessing upon Father Makarios as he continues his journey in the United States. May he arrive at his next destination, his hometown of Salt Lake, and his final destination of Modesto, California, and then return to Mount Sinai safe and healthy, granting long life and happiness, good fortune in his path. Through the prayers of our holy fathers, Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us.